Good morning, everybody. You will have noticed I'm not Leonie Cooper, who's supposed to be chairing. Unfortunately, she and Jeanette Arnold are stuck on the Northern Line, so they'll join us later. Can I have apologies? I'll welcome you all first. Welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Economy Committee. Today's meeting will focus on skills for the future, apprenticeship and skills. We encourage anyone to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtag Assembly Economy and Apprenticeships. We have very few short items of formal business to go through first. Can I ask all of you to make sure that your electronic devices are switched to the silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions this morning? Are there any apologies?
Thank you. We've received apologies for absence from Assembly Member Twycross, for whom Assembly Member Arnold will be attending as a substitute.
Thank you. Can I ask members to note the list of appointments set out on item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting held on the 18th of June 2019 as a correct record? Confirmed. Thank you. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions from previous meetings?
Noted.
Right, that now brings us to today's main item for discussion on skills for the future, apprenticeships and skills. So, can I welcome our guests? Jules Pipe, CBE, Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills. Michelle Cuomo-Boorer, Assistant Director for Skills and Employment. John Cope, Head of Education and Skills, Confederation of British Industry. And Nick Nelberg, Construction Ambassador and Project Manager, Managing Director, Earl and Calam Builders Limited. Welcome all of you. So we'll go straight into the questions. First to Jules, if I may. How would you describe your or the Mayor's role in improving the quality and quantity of apprenticeships in London?
Well, clearly the Mayor has a clear leadership role to play in this. Obviously the government's approach to apprenticeships has been to tax businesses within London to create the apprenticeship levy, and clearly there's an issue over how that levy is being dispersed or not dispersed within London, which I'm sure we'll come on to in later discussion. So that money doesn't come via City Hall, but clearly the Mayor has a role and exercises that role in leadership to try and stitch the pieces together, the patchwork together in London, to ensure that money is kept in London. We've got a long way to go on that. The system does tend to prevent the money being spent by the nature of the businesses that we have in London. We're seeing a bigger drop in apprenticeships across the country, and London isn't exempt from that. And we are in danger of seeing significant amounts of money either not spent in the country and returned to the exchequer, or even if, as the Minister says, all the money will be spent, it won't actually be spent in the regions that it's actually generated, because obviously London being the largest generator of apprenticeship funds. So the Mayor obviously has the Skills for London as a framework which he's brought forward, which has many parts to it. One part is the promotion of apprenticeships, and has a number of practical schemes to promote apprenticeships. Obviously one of them's the Mayor's Construction Academy. Again, we can explore some of the detail on that. Plus, we have some pilots that we're bringing forward as well to kind of to promote new approaches that will encourage the money to be spent. So there's one that we're doing with the IPPR, which the Mayor will be announcing later this year, which adopts some practical approaches in joining up the levy payers with people further down the supply chain to actually get the money spent by these smaller firms. Again, we can explore that later in the discussion if you wish.
Yes, I mean, we've got an extremely good brief. It's quite shocking the amount that isn't being used up, and because it's only got a period of time that it has to be used up by, doesn't it? A question now to John and mainly to John. What are your views on the 2017 reforms to apprenticeships, particularly the replacement of frameworks within the standard?
Yes, first, thank you for the invitation to come and speak here today. In 2017, there was a lot of changes, all happened at once, and they all tend to get merged into one. So I split them out into 3 different areas. There was the levy, which is the tax. There was how it was all implemented. And then there's a lot of other reforms that went on around the apprenticeship system. So while the levy obviously is a difficult thing always for business to consider an additional tax, there is a real recognition, I think, in CBI members that apprenticeships are incredibly important and something that's definitely worth investing in. That second area I mentioned around implementation in 2017, given everything that was going on, it was an incredibly rushed reform. There wasn't very much time for businesses to adapt to a new system. So what I mean by that is that you can see a split of all different types of sectors and businesses, so like construction or manufacturing, which has a history of apprenticeships. Actually, those sectors tend to have adapted pretty well to the apprenticeship levy and all the systems. However, sectors which didn't have a history of apprenticeships, or SMEs, tended to be a bit of a shock. So suddenly there's this cliff edge of actually you're going from one system to another. And 2 years on, or 2.5 years on, we're starting, a lot of work that my team and I have been doing with our members. We're trying to get our members up to speed, get them onto the system. So the third area is everything else that went on around the levy. It's very separate to the levy. So the Institute for Apprenticeships, which oversees the shift from frameworks to standards that you mentioned. A lot of new rules around apprenticeships came in, around 20% of it has to be off the job, a legal requirement that apprenticeships have to be 12 months long. A new approach for actually how you get provision. Every apprenticeship that comes under the levy must be approved by a Trailblazer group of employers and then approved by the Institute for Apprenticeships as well as Department of Education and the ESFA. So this new process came in, again with a bit of a cliff edge. And a lot of these reforms that I mentioned have different impacts on different businesses. So the 20% off the job, for instance, is one of those rules that can be quite inflexible. But to address your question specifically around the shift from frameworks to standards, difficult to begin with, but the right change is how I summarise it. Frameworks tended to be quite tick box exercises, have you done X, Y and Z, whereas standards are a much higher quality, much more expansive set, and they are designed by employers. The apprenticeship levy is meant to be an employer-led reform. So on that question, I think, the shift from frameworks to standards has been a very good thing.
Thing is, though, employers have all got different criteria, and from different trades it changes drastically, doesn't it? Does anybody else want to comment on that point? Or
well, I'd endorse the fact that it's the right approach, it's the implementation that's been the problem.
Yeah, I can
The principle
imagine.
is correct.
I can imagine. Michelle, can I ask you, what engagement has your team had with the Institute of Apprenticeships and Technical Education around apprenticeships and the development of another pathway to learning T-levels?
So quite a lot. We do a huge amount of work with all of those kind of partners, as well as with DFE and the ESFA, who also have a role in all of those. There's some specific things we've been doing over the last few years, which is working very closely with the Institute of Apprenticeships and the ESFA around the different apprenticeships that are on offer. We have also met with the Minister on a number of occasions now over the last year. I think we've met with her probably 2 or 3 times specifically to talk about apprenticeships and how we can maximise the apprenticeships in London. And we've also held some roundtables with our colleagues and with business, again to look at how we can maximise the use of the levy in London, how we can increase apprenticeships and how we can work with specific groups within those. As Jules mentioned earlier, the Skills for Londoners Board has a specific group which looks at apprenticeships specifically, which colleagues around the table are also on. And again, that is working with those colleagues across not just apprenticeships but T-levels. We also work incredibly closely with the FE sector and providers, whether that's work-based learning providers that deliver apprenticeships directly. We meet with them at least on a quarterly basis to discuss some of those areas. And so we have a fairly good relationship, I think, across those providers and work closely.
It must be so difficult, though, when the changes are so drastic. I know it from the old days. I haven't been involved with the new system. Jules, what information can you give us regarding the Mayor's progress on the objectives set out in the Skills for Londoners strategy and framework, particularly what work has been done in preparation for the incoming T-levels?
Actually, I'll have to hand over to Michelle for that on incoming T-levels, on preparation for that.
So I think it's probably fair to say we haven't done a huge amount of preparation on incoming T-levels. We're working with those providers that are working on the pilots of T-levels or will be delivering T-levels. But as yet, obviously, I'm right to say I've been off for 2 weeks. I'm assuming they haven't come in while I've been off. But we are working with those providers that will be delivering those in London.
Okay. I mean, what are the timeframes in place for the commissioning and dissemination of research?
I will have to come back to you on that. I believe there is some research underway already, but I'll come back to you with the specific dates and timelines.
Okay, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go on to our next section of questions. I think, Sean, you're doing these, aren't you? Yes.
Just this to Jules to start with. Are there any plans to formally evaluate the impact of apprenticeships on the London economy? Are there any plans to formally evaluate the impact of apprenticeships on the London economy?
Yes, absolutely. It's not just simply apprenticeships. Actually, we're looking to measure the impact, not just on the economy, but also the social impact of all further education training that takes place.
But will apprenticeships be separated out? Because obviously it's a separate stream of money, etc., etc.
Yes, yeah. But we're keen to sort of measure both, as I say, both the economic and social impact, and we're discussing with people at the moment about what those metrics should actually be. And this will be the first time, obviously, that this has been done in a kind of a longitudinal way, and actually seeing what kind of the over time and seeing the impact that it actually has on individuals, rather than just sort of the general mass of the economy of London.
Okay, I mean, that makes this renders this next question slightly irrelevant, because it's how much does the government apprenticeship scheme benefit London financially, and clearly that piece of work is in train.
Yes, but there is an overall, there's an overall figure for nationally that's available, but it hasn't been drilled down into, no one can provide a specific London figure. It's something like 34 billion nationally, isn't it? It's quite an extraordinary high figure nationally that adds to the economy. So it must make a significant impact within London. However, obviously we know that the take-up of apprenticeships is lower in London than elsewhere in the economy. Almost 12 points of the difference is down to the nature of London's businesses. High-end service economy like legal, finance, tend not to have lend so many apprenticeship positions within those firms, and it's often in those cases where one will be pushing them to organise with their supply chains and have something further down. But again, the supply chains often are also challenged to find apprenticeship positions. I remember when Amazon moved into London, and it was expecting to expand, by thousands its staff in its new offices in Shoreditch, and the then head of Amazon in London told me that every single one of their employees would likely to be a graduate. So it kind of typifies those kind of challenges of the kind of businesses that we have in London, and that does explain quite a significant proportion of the lower take-up of apprenticeships in London than elsewhere in the country. But it doesn't explain it all.
So you're effectively saying that the nature of business in London generally means that we tend to generate less of the positions that are traditionally looked at as apprenticeship positions. Yeah. I wonder if there's a piece of work around innovation that the type of business we generate could have apprenticeships. I think we need to have the idea, just because it hasn't been done like that doesn't mean it cannot be done like that. But of course that's probably someone else's problem more than yours.
It's just worth to say that Jules is absolutely right. Historically, London has not done well, purely because of the types of businesses, but some significant work has taken place over the last few years to try and work with different types of businesses to increase apprentices in other areas. I don't know whether John probably can talk about some of his members who are not traditional businesses in that sense.
Absolutely. So I can't, the Deputy Mayor is correct in the sense that there aren't GDP figures for the impact, but we do regularly talk to our members about do they have apprenticeship schemes, what's their experience been of the levy and all the different forms going on. And we know that when the levy came in, about 83%, this is a survey of our members, so not all of our members, but a survey of a subset, 83% had apprenticeship programmes. A year on, so last year, 70% had apprenticeship programmes. So that's a really significant drop. And the national drop overall in apprenticeship starts was 20% in the latest government data. In London, that was 17%. So
was it slightly better?
Yes.
Only very slightly, though.
Yeah, indeed. But the most startling statistic, so this is again London specific, and this is us surveying our members, we found that 2 in 5 don't spend any of their levy. 2 in 5 spend less than half, with leaving just 1/5 that spend over half.
Okay, I suspect this is a theme we'll return to later on in the questioning. Let me just move on. What do you feel are the core benefits businesses gain through apprenticeships? John?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at our education system, we are incredibly good at encouraging young people to do GCSEs, A-levels, do a bachelor's degree and into work. But that is a one track, and there needs to be other tracks available. And I think often when we're speaking to our members, CBI members, they recognise that actually that offers a certain type of recruitment, a certain type of employee, but it's not always the one that they're looking for. So actually apprenticeships and other forms of technical education often combine a lot wider range. So while the education system is very good at knowledge, actually what an apprenticeship offers is being able to apply that knowledge in a real world setting. It gives a real experience to the workplace. So rather than receiving a graduate from university who will know a lot, will have a wide breadth of knowledge, actually taking an apprentice on allows you to, yes, train them, yes, give them the knowledge, but actually shape that person to fit them into the business, around the business's culture. So a lot of the time, actually, an apprenticeship can just offer a much happier recruitment process.
What I would add to that, though, is that I think one of the biggest challenges that apprenticeships face is their presentation, historic presentation within this country. Because John's absolutely right to say that it's a way of progressing, applying the knowledge that you're gaining. Unfortunately, in this country, they've often been portrayed as training that you do if you haven't got haven't achieved a basic level of education. And I think we really do need to move away from this. I think the overarching problem in this country is that as far as I'm concerned, is that it's relaxed about an education standard of employment being around sort of 65% is acceptable of people achieving that standard. 65% getting 5 or more including English, GCSEs including English and Maths, is somehow an acceptable standard. When there are schools in London that are showing that even with challenging cohorts, 80+%, approaching 90% of pupils can achieve 5 or more, including English and Maths. And so once you have a cohort of 90% achieving that, then yes, some can go the academic route, some could be looking to go through apprenticeships, but I think we should be looking as apprenticeships as something you do with 5 or more, including English and Maths, not something you do because you didn't get 5 or more, including English and Maths.
I would just quickly add as well that one of the levy has led to quite a behaviour change, actually, in what an apprenticeship is. Traditionally, you would see an apprenticeship as a young person getting their first step into a career. Whereas what the levy has led to, actually, when you move to a more punitive kind of tax arrangement like the levy is, obviously that forces a business to think, how do I get the biggest bang for my buck? How do I most effectively use my levy? And that isn't always getting new people into the business. That can be about upskilling and retraining. So we've seen a big change actually in the behaviour and the use of the levy, and new types of apprenticeships arising. So not just apprenticeships at level 2 and level 3 around GCSE and A-level level, the growth of the degree apprenticeship has become an immense thing. You know, while yes, at the bottom end, that 20% fall that I mentioned is definitely true. There has been a massive increase in degree apprenticeships at the top end.
And you would say that's a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's high quality technical education that is making people have higher skills and more productive. So yeah, it is a good thing. The bad, or not bad is the wrong word, I suppose, but the potential negative of that growth in degree apprenticeships is a huge financial pressure on the levy. Degree apprenticeships and sometimes even sort of MBA level apprenticeships are much longer, much more expensive, and that obviously causes a pressure on the apprenticeship levy. It's one of the reasons why actually the levy is financially becoming less and less sustainable.
Because it confused a lot of people for a long time as to why the government were absolutely adamant that the levy would all be spent despite the enormous drop in apprenticeships. But actually that is one of the key reasons why the budget will be under strain through the cost of higher level apprenticeships.
Nick, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm just, I don't know how many years ago it was that there was a shift from doing an apprenticeship and becoming a tradesperson was like a proud thing to do, and parents were, go and become a carpenter, go and become a bricklayer.
Nick, you're both quite a long way for your microphone. You've also got your water in front of it.
And so it used to be a proud thing to, parents used to send their kids off to do apprenticeships in trades. Or whereas there was a shift, I don't know, was it 30 years ago or something, where we were becoming dimmer than the rest of the world and we should all go to university, and there was this big push for everyone to go to higher education, and the schools were given incentives, and the actual funding for apprenticeships was all sort of bundled up. And subsequently we're now in a position where parents look and they're like, no, go to university. It gives you, you've got a better step up the ladder if you've got a degree. And so there we've got lots of people who've got degrees and not necessarily should be, trained in what they're trained, and maybe should have gone on an apprenticeship and become a tradesperson.
I suppose that conveniently leads me to my final question about what are the core benefits London gains from apprenticeships, particularly through youth engagement. And I think particularly when you're talking in the way you are about the involvement of parents, because it says the word youth here, but realistically when you talk about apprenticeships, you talk about work, there's a big parental piece here, because your parents are the people who push you in one direction or another, largely. Are we using apprenticeships in the correct way? Because it sounds like you're saying, no, we're not selling them, or we're not using them to the best of their ability, as it were.
Yeah, but like we were saying, if you can count to 5, you go to university, and if you can count to 4, you go into a vocational qualification or an MVQ or an apprenticeship. And I guess that's wrong, isn't it? That's not. We want to encourage, the right people to be going into these courses, not the people who can't do something else. And I guess that's what we're seeing from the ground, where people are coming to us and they've done an MVQ in carpentry, but they don't necessarily want to be a carpenter. They just were told, oh, why don't you try that? And so it's not kind of pushing people into the positions who want to do it, with a spark in the eye. That's why I became a construction ambassador, to kind of rattle the cage and go, come on, this is a great industry to work in, and to show that you can run your own business, you have all this ability, and you can start from the ground, digging the hole and filling the skip, and go all the way up to running the company.
That's a key point there about about going on to run the company. I think again it's about reputation, and it's particularly in the construction sector, which the leaders of in construction and construction skills training recognise the fact that there's got to be there's a huge job of rehabilitation to do in terms of the construction sector's reputation with parents, and that. As well as young people, but both need to be tackled if we're going to get young people going into construction. And one of the key things we have to convince people of, and it not just a case of convincing them, it has to be genuine, that there are pathways that could take them anywhere from going into construction. No parent is going to want their child to go into construction if they think that when that child is age 50, they're still going to be on they have no other choice other than being on a building site at 6 in the morning in the freezing winter when they're 50, 60 or whatever. If that's the path you choose, absolutely fine. There's no criticism implied of that. But for a parent and for a young person, they're going to want to feel that the sky's the limit. And they need to know that they could, if they want to, they can get into construction at the ground floor, age 16, 17, 18, and actually, if they get into their 20s and they decide that actually it's more the engineering side that I'm interested in construction, and actually I've got to do some sort of higher qualification, or maybe even a degree in engineering, that the pathways would be available for that higher training to that they can, for them to take that path. Whereas instead, what we do is we don't engage the minds of young primary school kids and excite them about building things like that. That's the time we should be grabbing people when they're in primary school, not to channel them into things, but actually convince them of the expansive opportunities that there are in this country, and particularly in London, and excite them by those prospects and the whole variation of things that they could do in later life, and then as they progress through secondary school, demonstrate to them the different pathways that they could take to achieve that. And that's what we need to do, I think, as a country, to actually get people excited about doing something in building something rather than appearing on YouTube for a living.
But my initial question talks about youth engagement, and I suppose as much as it is about engaging youth, as you highlighted there, Jules, it's also about the organisations they're in, because it's schools who sell university as the be-all and end-all, and who is selling apprenticeships to young people as a positive forward step. That's the challenge. That's where it lies.
There's 2 points that I would make. First, around just cautioning about making that distinction between university and apprenticeships and technical, and second, around careers advice. On the first point, a lot of apprenticeships are done by universities, degree apprenticeships, things like that. Universities do technical education, they do apprenticeships, and conversely, 10% of higher education is in colleges. So the distinction between them is probably an obvious one, but when you dig a little deeper, actually universities can do really a lot on this, and often are the ones that engage. So it's not universities versus colleges, actually both do both. And then on the second area, careers advice, I would echo the Deputy Mayor. It's careers advice in this country is appalling. And has been for a very long time. And we're at a very low bar, but I think we're starting to make progress with the Careers Enterprise Company. So we, as the CBI, are partnered with the Careers Enterprise Company. They have a network of careers leaders across the country, setting up careers hubs with government money, and getting volunteer business leaders to be enterprise advisors, to go into schools and provide the careers advice we're talking about. And we're partnered with them to plug our members in. Because every time when we ask them, are you enthusiastic about getting involved in education skills, we are always overwhelmed with those that are enthusiastic about getting involved. But often the barriers are, who do I talk to? What do I do? How can I help? How do I make work experience meaningful? It's these kinds of questions that business people tend to ask. So then, and they also come against a lot of bureaucracy and health and safety and things like that. So we're working with the Careers Enterprise Company to address exactly that point. And I would echo the point as well that primary school has to be the time to make these kinds of interventions. At the moment, the Gatsby benchmarks, which are a sort of framework around what high quality careers advice is, those Gatsby benchmarks, there's 8 of them, they are aimed at colleges and secondary schools, but we don't have Gatsby benchmarks for what careers appropriate, so age appropriate careers advice looks like in primary. And often that is the point where you lose people. Especially girls in STEM, for instance. There's a lot of evidence actually that girls turn off from STEM careers, maths, science, engineering, what it is, in primary school, and never get re-engaged back in secondary. So you've lost them at that point, and that is echoed in lots of other areas.
I mean, the Mayor's been lobbying for the devolution of careers advice and guidance monies, as well as its restoration to previous levels, and then devolved to the regions, including City Hall. But meanwhile, the Mayor has expanded the London Enterprise Advisor Network that John referred to, put significant monies, match funding monies into that, so that we get an enterprise advisor into every single secondary school and college that wants one in London, whereas I think originally it was only about a third of the schools.
What's the take-up?
I think we were getting to 80%, weren't we?
We can give you the figures.
Yeah, we can give you the figures on that. And City Hall has a role in kind of coordinating sort of the what one would refer to as sort of apprenticeship ambassador activities. So all these different people who go out there, like the enterprise advisors and others in the capital, to ensure that sort of career services and related activities are working together to promote apprenticeships as an alternative to university.
The other things that are really important to mention as well is the annual careers fair, Skills London, that happens over in Excel. That will be happening again this year. I think it's in November. The Mayor usually attends that, and that really sits over 2 days, where the first day is sort of targeted at secondary school pupils and maybe some of those that are younger, and then the second day is then for parents to come along. And again, that's sort of trying to look at opportunities, whether that be apprenticeships. There's significant apprenticeship presence at that careers fair. It's incredibly well attended, and it's something we're really happy to support, along with London First and others who put that on.
Something like 40,000 young people, I think,
I've
attend over
been
2
to
days.
it. It's very good. But it goes back to a comment that John made. I'm going to stop now, but it goes back to a comment that John made. I think universities are a very good way of this, because it's a brand, isn't it, a parents' university. But let's be clear, it isn't about apprenticeship versus university. It's about apprenticeship versus degree. That's how people see it. Where it came, where the degree or apprenticeship comes from is not the point. It's apprenticeship versus degree. But thank you, that's enough from me, Chair.
I thought, okay, actually, it's okay. Right, and I'm going to thank Assembly Member Susan Hall for taking the chair while I was having an enjoyable experience not finding any access to the Northern Line, and then having a lovely time on South Western Railways where there's a derailment. So thank you very much, Assembly Member Hall. And I think I'm coming back to you for the next set of questions to begin with.
Thank you. If I can start with you, John. What have employers told you are the main issues with the levy?
So I suppose I preface my comments with I think every employer has a different experience of the levy and has implemented the levy in a different way, which actually makes reforming it and making it better and refining it actually quite a difficult task. So for some, and this tends to be outside of urban centres, it could be a lack of provision. Actually just finding provision can be really quite difficult, whether it's a provider or actually it's just the apprenticeship standard that we spoke about earlier hasn't been approved. So to begin with, apprenticeship standards were taking up to 2 years to be approved. So that's a long time for employers who try and design a qualification and not being approved. So lack of provision was a massive issue. That has come down significantly now. We're the Institute of Apprenticeships, we partner with to try and help them improve their service, are aiming to get a standard approval process down to 8 months for 80% of standards. But the problem is still there. And I faced the problem myself. I looked at, could the CBI do an apprenticeship route into organisation. I sort of looked at, is there a standard out there? No, there isn't. And then I found one very low down. It was a sort of level 3, level 4, probably not as high as we would use. And the nearest provider was in the north of England. So that's an experience that I had, and I know that's an experience that a lot of our members have, where they will lack the standard or lack the actual provider. So again, it goes back to my original points, a lot of reforms happened very, very quickly, all at once, and we're all now doing catch-up. The 20% off the job rule, we spoke about very briefly earlier, is certainly an issue that comes up. I'm in two minds, I must admit, on whether the 20% off the job is a good thing or a bad thing. So it is a good thing in the sense of if a significant portion of an apprenticeship isn't off the job in training, well, it's not an apprenticeship, it's sort of low-paid work almost. And an apprenticeship must include a significant amount of high-quality training. So the 20% off the job rule actually acts as a guarantor of that quality, and that the young person or an adult or whoever is taking the apprenticeship gets training. However, on the bad side, for especially at the SME, smaller employer end, the idea of having to backfill 20% or the transport costs for somebody or all these other barriers, it could become quite prohibitive. But a lot of the time, actually, in my experience, the real problem with 20% off the job is poor explanation of what it actually means. A lot of the time it's treated in an incredibly rigid way, that it's 20% block time, a couple of months or whatever it might be, in a college somewhere. That can be often an interpretation of that rule, but a lot of the time it can be much more flexible. It can be a few hours a week, maybe a few blocks. It doesn't actually have to be off-site, for instance, as I understand it. It can be on-site, just off the job. So there is a real job here for the Institute for Apprenticeships and for the CBI and for others to try and get some best practice, some proper guidance on the 20% off the job to try and make it as less of a barrier as possible. Another area that I would pick up on, it sounds a little bit technical, but endpoint assessments. This is, if you're in order to actually be assessed that you've passed your apprenticeship, you've got your qualification, there has to be an assessment by somebody, and there's a growing issue of standards being approved without actually an assessment ready to do assessment. So young people are starting qualifications without actually a person or a process for assessment at the end, and there's kind of like a we'll sort that out eventually type approach. Which often isn't good enough. And that means a lot of the time what's meant to be a backstop, to coin a phrase, on this is the Institute for Apprenticeships and Ofqual can act as a sort of, if you can't find an organisation to do the assessment, Ofqual or the Institute for Apprenticeships can do the assessment. And a lot of our research finds that the vast majority of all the endpoint assessments are done by the Institute for Apprenticeships and Ofqual. Which means that it's not a particularly situation you'd want to. You want a much more independent system. The biggest barrier, we've sort of touched on it a little bit, however, I think that's coming down the tracks, is a real lack of explanation of what the levy system actually is, which is why you get a situation where at a system level, the levy's overspent in the next year to 18 months, and a huge financial pressure on it. And the government will have to make a decision and change it in some way to address that financial pressure, whether that's getting more money in or tightening the scope of the levy. So that's the system experience, but the actual employer's experience is still desperately trying to get their levy, and being unable to do it for a variety of reasons I've just spoken about. And now those experiences should not be possible at the same time. It's illogical. And when I try and explain it to our members, they look at me very confused. Like, how is that possible? And that's because when the levy first came in, it was explained as you put in X amount of money and you'll be able to get that back. And that is how it was sold to business members and to levy payers. But that's not how the system's actually set up. And there are a huge number of reasons. We spoke about a few around degree apprenticeships, the increasing costs, but also the biggest pressure is that the levy pot doesn't just cover the provision of levy payers. And levy payers are those with a payroll above 3 million. The levy pot also covers non-levy payers, which is the vast majority of businesses in the country. And quite how much that costs is not clear. So the point I would make is the system wasn't properly explained to employers, so they're now they're sort of in this sort of frustration of what's going on, why is it overspent, but I can't get my levy. So the point I would make, the overarching point, is that there needs to be a much greater transparency from government, a much greater amount of data put out there explaining where the levy is being spent, how it's being spent, why there's a financial pressure, and why employers still can't get their levy.
The trouble is, of course, it's so complex because every business has got a different requirement from their staff and the bureaucracy. If you're a very small business and you're not paying into the levy, that could be why our figures are falling, because you get to the point you'd think, I just don't want to go there.
Our survey found, again, this is the previous survey of our members that I mentioned, about 26% roughly have written off the levy as a tax. disengaged entirely.
Sorry, can you repeat that figure again?
26% of the members that we surveyed have written off the levy as a tax.
Okay.
It's a tax, I pay it, I then do my training separately.
And is there irritation there over that?
Well, it's usually a case of trying to engage, trying to make it work, failing, and actually thinking the amount of effort and resource that I'd have to put in to get my levy back is greater than actually my levy. So I'll just pay my tax and I'll just do a learning and development budget elsewhere.
It's down to bureaucracy, which businesses don't need, do they? Okay, thank you. I think Jeanette wanted to come in.
It's just on that point, John, surely this has been known about. I've certainly heard this spoken about for some while now. So, as the CBI and other organisations, you've clearly put this case to government. So, what did you hear from government? Because that clearly is a huge block for so many of our businesses who have the commitment, who bought into the plan.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's sort of like a very well-known secret,
Yes.
What I've just described, but only amongst people like us, people who sort of get into the detail. As soon as you go into actual employers that don't spend their time reading the FE week and
But my
Times
question
Educational
was,
Supplement.
what did government say once you have put it to them? Because surely you must have taken this and mentioned it in your many meetings.
Absolutely, no,
with
we
ministers.
regularly do, and I've stood on platforms and said it publicly. And the Institute for Apprenticeships has published their own forecast, which is part of government, is a non-exec, non-departmental body, have put out their own predictions on the shortfall on the levy. Now they were disputed.
Government ministers disputed.
Treasury disputed,
Treasury
actually,
disputed.
because this is the point I was sort of coming on to, is that there are lots of different actors in this. It is, at the end of the day, it is a tax legally, and therefore the Treasury has a huge part to play in this. The department has a huge part in this, as well as the Institute for Apprenticeships and various other bodies, which is half the problem. So many people are sort of got their fingers in this pie. So when we speak about this, to answer your question very directly, to ministers, we don't get any pushback. That there is huge financial pressure on the levy. I've seen Department for Education ministers accept that pressure. I've never seen one go to the dispatch box, nor be as explicit perhaps as I have been. I think that would be very welcome from business, actually to grasp the nettle, to sort of fess up and say, this is the reality, this is the pressure, these are the choices ahead of us, because there are choices, and one of them will be business paying more, or narrowing the scope of the levy and saying to business, you can't spend your levy on X, Y and Z to try and manage the financial pressure. So those decisions are coming down the tracks, and we're doing all we can to try and communicate that to our members and explain them to them. But yeah, I would certainly welcome Department of Education Minister being very explicit about these choices and going a little bit further perhaps than they already have. And I think Treasury should have to join them in that. And the spending review, and most likely comprehensive spending review, this year is the opportunity to have that clarity and transparency.
Thank you.
I'd certainly endorse what John has said, and I recognised everything that he said, particularly on the transparency point. As I said earlier, the confusion that has reigned over the fact that particularly in London, the pot hasn't been spent, yet at the same time the pot's empty. And explaining that how that's come about is problematic. That the fact that clarity isn't there. And on the point regarding costs, it's something that Mayor has been consistently lobbying about. We'd like to see a proportion, small portion, 10%, up to 10% of the levy being able to be used for administration costs in certain circumstances, and certainly more support for SMEs to be able to access these funds.
But just on that point, and to follow up where Jeanette was going with the questioning, just before we move on to Susan and Sean's next questions, you said 26% of the larger members have sort of given up even trying to figure out where the money is going to, and it's just too much bother to sort out apprenticeships coming back into their own business. So are you able to quantify that in terms of how much money that is? You said 26% of your members, but I don't know how much they're paying in. You must have a feel for how much that is.
Yeah, so just to be really clear, I suppose the question we asked is, have you written off and disengaged with the levy? Not have you not done apprenticeships, taken on apprenticeships. So what we found is that, and the converse of course is true, 74% of those surveyed are engaging with it as a skills policy, are working with it. So the vast majority are engaging, but there is a far too larger minority that have disengaged, and that disengagement could take many different forms. It could go to what you've just described of just, I'm not doing it, but it could also be a case of paying for apprenticeships in addition to it.
But basically you're saying you haven't quantified it in terms of, you know, they've paid something in and they haven't got something back. And I'm just wondering, you know, has that money then gone to the SMEs who are not paying into the pot, as you also described?
That is the lack of transparency that we're describing here.
And do we have any figures for that in London?
We have never asked our members about specific money, what they have and haven't spent and what they have and haven't spent it on. But that should, and I would expect that data does exist in government about what is being spent or is not being spent. And that's the sort of transparency that we really need.
Because we're very happy to write as a committee, but at the moment we would be writing about really something very vague, and it's also you know, possible that we would get no more clarity than any of you, particularly in the current circumstances where you're saying that there are impending changes. Okay, I'm going to come back to Susan Hall.
Okay. I'll move on to a slightly different aspect of this. Michelle, what action has or can the Mayor take combating the misappropriations of levy funds, particularly in light of reports that businesses are classifying low-paid work as apprenticeships?
Well, I suppose there's a number of things, and as we've said, the Mayor isn't directly responsible for apprenticeship funding, all the rules around that, but there are a number of areas that the Mayor is very committed to. So one of those things is around the Good Work Standard, for example, encouraging businesses to take that on, encouraging businesses to ensure that apprentices are paid at the London Living Wage. That's absolutely clear, and that is the case of apprentices within City Hall, that should be the minimum. We are also working on a pilot, which Jules mentioned earlier, which I've completely forgotten the name of.
London
Progression
Collaborative.
So it's changed its name, with IPPR and JP Morgan. And we're looking to work with businesses to do some of the things that actually have been discussed here. So sort of relieve some of the administrative burden of delivering apprenticeships, and also making sure that those further down the supply chain are able to access apprentices. Now, part of that is obviously the role of advocacy around living wage, and that apprentices should be paid fairly, and that should be recognised within that programme of activity. That programme is particularly looking at social mobility as well, so using apprenticeships to support social mobility.
Okay, I mean, we must bear in mind, though, in some instances, it's the amount of work that an employer puts into that apprentice. If they then have to pay living wage, etc., it knocks it out of kilt completely, and they just can't do it. We don't want to do anything that would discourage people taking on apprenticeships.
Absolutely. I think it's probably worth recognising, though, I think you mentioned earlier, John, the number of apprentices who are in that sort of adult cohort is greater than the younger side. The apprenticeship wage is incredibly low. I can't remember exactly what it is. It's around £2 something, maybe slightly more than that now.
£3.
So there's an incredibly low wage associated with apprenticeships, which I think the Mayor has quite rightly said, actually, if we want to invest in these people, then it should be at the living wage.
Yes, of course, it only affects the very small businesses.
Exactly.
If there's a problem. You mentioned the Good Work Standard. How many people have signed up to that?
The Good Work Standard hasn't currently been launched. I have to say it's not my area of expertise. Jules may know a little bit more. It's due to be launched in the autumn, and I know the team responsible for that are doing a huge amount of work with businesses to encourage them to sign up.
I thought it should have been done out by now.
Now, we had a very long discussion about this last time, and it's not in the purview for this meeting, and I think you know that we all share your views. I don't want to get distracted into the Good Work Standard launch.
I'm just hoping that at some point somebody will be able to...
It's not their specialist subject, so let's go back to apprenticeships, if you don't mind. We did spend a long time discussing this at the last meeting, and we will be coming back to it with the right team.
Nick? What can the Mayor do to support small businesses in overcoming the challenges they face with the levy and the costs associated with taking on an apprentice?
Right, so I am a small business. I'm a small builder, have been for 25 years. And before joining the Federation of Master Builders about 5 years ago, we were just, we had a kind of a view that big business trained people, big business paid levy, trained people, and that us signing up for a levy would be something we couldn't afford to do, and we couldn't afford to actually take on trainees to put them through our business. And we and since joining the FMB, we now kind of have a better understanding of how the whole system works, which I think a lot of SMEs are in this kind of place where they think, we can't afford to do it. But these days, it's not like in the old days where someone would join your business and stay with your business. They come to your business and then...
Yes, that's right, and then they go again.
Yeah, with the skills shortage, it puts even more pressure because the financial incentive for someone to go, oh, you're a bit skilled, I'll take you, thank you very much, have a few more pounds. And that whole sort of minimum wage and the you know, we're getting people into our business, and we've been trying everything. We're getting people, we're trying to sort out Apprentice at the moment, but we've been getting people, young people who have been doing NBQs into our business, and we're paying them a bit too much to get them into our business, which puts pressure on the business, and then they're not performing as well as we need them to, and we're trying to train them, and it's not, you know, so it's I don't know, it's a big sort of conundrum at the moment, and that's really why I'm here, to try and kind of understand it and see what we can do.
Okay. It's not an easy thing running a small business. No, it isn't, especially with all this bureaucracy around it. That does not help.
So
Sure.
Is there any, Nick, and maybe everybody, is there anything that can be done to make apprenticeships more valuable to smaller companies, so that they're interested, so that it's worthwhile? Because this goes back to the whole thing of numbers falling in the first place. If companies don't value them, then nobody will.
Well, certainly things that can be done to make them more viable for small businesses. Refer back to the comment I made about funding for administration costs and support and advice and guidance, which is, as I say, what we're piloting through the IPPR programme and a number of other initiatives we'd like to bring forward, because, as I say, we think it's going to need a number of pilots to see what works well. But also allowing for pooling and joint purchasing of transferred apprenticeships from the bigger levy payers. So actually, you know, smaller and, you know, SMEs pooling together, and then funds being transferred to them from higher up. There's a couple of rules that need to be changed, which we've kept on raising this with the Minister over the last year, 18 months, and they're reluctant to do that. Again, it's quite opaque. We go through cycles of, oh, you can do that, and then it's explored, and then we'll come across some rules which actually are then very unhelpful, that prevent us getting over the line, that frees things up for SMEs to draw down on this more easily.
Okay, thank you.
To your point around SMEs, this was something that was firmly front of mind for us in the spending review and budget last year. You know, the CBI has a huge range of members and a lot of SMEs, and they are the part of this of the system that's sort of creaking the most, almost alongside young people. So when we campaigned in the budget last year, two of the most important things that we managed to convince the government of was around raising the transfers cap, which the Deputy Mayor just mentioned. So it was 10%, which was a win that we had at the start. We made that case and won that at the start. We then made the case that should rise to 25%. So levy payers are able to transfer 25% of their levy pot to non-levy payers and to others. So we made the case it should be higher, because often 10%, it was a tiny amount, especially for marginal levy payers. It could not even be the cost of one apprentice. So we made the case the transfer cap to be raised, and that now creates the opportunity for this kind of partnership work that the Deputy Mayor just made. And I would point to Andy Street in the West Midlands as an example of where a mayor can facilitate and convene this kind of activity. Absolutely. So he has brought together levy and non-levy payers trying to join the dots, because actually the ability to transfer is okay, but unless you know who to transfer to. And unless there's an obvious person in your supply chain or a business next door, how do you find someone? So what's happening in the West Midlands Combined Authority is a kind of, I think Andy refers to it, sort of speed dating for apprenticeships, where he puts levy payers and non-levy payers together and encourages them to form a pot. Now this is perfectly fine with existing rules, it doesn't require any changes, and it's working quite well as I understand it. So it's certainly an opportunity there for a mayor to sort of convene. We also made the case for the cost to be dropped. So originally non-levy payers paid the 10% of the cost of an apprenticeship. They now pay 5%, in recognition again of all the sort of the burdens that an SME can specifically face. But looking forward, that's sort of a bit of a backward look, but looking forward, this financial pressure on the levy, in my view, the biggest financial pressure is the fact that the pot covers non-levy payers. And it's sort of like a hidden element of the system that was never explained at the start. So we are now looking very carefully ahead of the comprehensive spending review at the end of the year at what the costs would be for the Treasury to do what I understand was the original design of the policy, but for the Treasury to cover the cost of non-levy payers. And that would release the burden on the levy, and you'd move to a situation where the goodwill you would generate with business would be immense, and finally you would get to a situation where, as a business, if you pay in however much, you'll be able to get that much back to spend on apprenticeships. So the pot would become financially sustainable, and you'd get the goodwill with employers and engage, hopefully, that 26% that have disengaged entirely.
Thank you.
Jules, I admire Andy Street greatly, and he's worked with John Lewis and now as a mayor. Jules, have you considered doing anything like that, getting the large levy payers?
That's what these pilots are about. All the combined authorities and the GLA have worked very closely on the whole skills agenda, so all the ideas that everyone's using are actively shared.
Yeah, so I meet very regularly with my counterparts across all of the other MCAs, in particularly with Manchester and the West Midlands, to look at what they're doing around things. Actually, careers advice is probably one of the things that we discuss the most, as well as the adult budget. As we mentioned, the London Progression Pilot is aiming to do just that, working across 3 sectors initially, in construction, retail and hospitality, and then expanding into an additional 3 sectors at the moment, which aren't quite defined, but we're looking probably at creative industries, those kind of things. The Mayor is seeking, or will be investing, I think it's around £1.3 million into supporting that from his own funds. So there is a significant recognition that we need to be doing something in London on this, similar to the West Midlands, but perhaps better, hopefully, because it's in London. But there's a lot of learning to be done from our counterparts as well on this.
Thank you. And my last question to Jules or Michelle, given the cost of apprenticeships is actually higher by a factor of 2 than was anticipated when the levy was implemented, what contingency is there in place should the levy funds be unable to meet London's demands?
I think as it's been outlined, the Mayor doesn't have responsibility for those funds. We don't believe that the funding is coming back into London on apprenticeships, and we suggest the numbers suggest that. So obviously the Mayor's other funding around further education that we have available, the adult education budget, which he will take responsibility for on the 1st of August, is going to be one of the key things to help support business. I attended a business breakfast with London First members probably about a month ago to talk about how we could support those businesses, both with apprenticeships but also with how the Mayor could best use the adult education budget to support some of those things. One of the key things that come up in those discussions is things like traineeships, pre-apprenticeships. How can we support those? Those aren't currently part of the Mayor's package of adult education budget, but something certainly that we are lobbying for to support that activity.
So hopefully the contingency is the fact that he's got, was it 311 million, something like that, coming over, and that could be a source of funds.
It won't fund apprenticeships, but what it will fund is other types of provision which could support, will support business, will support individuals. So it provides a flexibility there, and we are working very closely with both private providers that deliver apprenticeships, colleges, and others to make sure that that budget is maximised to support London's businesses and its communities.
Okay, thank you. Sure.
Earlier on, we talked about apprenticeships as a way of engaging young people around social mobility, getting access to high quality training. But we also talked about the fact that there's been a 20-point drop in apprenticeships across the country, 17-point drop in London, but yet we have a strong or even growing number of the higher end apprenticeships, the more costly, the more in work, so pushing people up. Is there a tension there between our need to do social mobility and the fact that we're helping people in good jobs get even better jobs?
Yeah, there's always going to be a tension on a fixed pot of money. I suppose the point I would make that sort of covers everything you've just said is to ask the question, what is the apprenticeship levy trying to achieve?
Okay, yeah.
It's trying to achieve a lot of things. It's trying to encourage and support employers to take on apprentices. It's also trying to your point, the sociability element of getting young people into their first job. It's also about upskilling senior managers. It's also about retraining people from one job to another. So the track we've sort of fallen into a little bit is that it's almost sort of counterintuitively too successful in that it's become a bit of a panacea. So quite a small pot of money, about 2.5 billion, 3 billion if you consider the devolved Barnet consequentials. It's quite a small pot of money when you spread it across the country and say that pot is going to have to solve all of our problems on technical education. They have to upskill everyone, retrain everyone, and also give lots of young people, the 50% that don't go to university, to a bachelor's degree, give those 50% their first leg into a job. It's a small pot of money. So yeah, those tensions will always exist unless the government is a bit more honest, transparent about what are we trying to achieve. The example I would give is that still technically it's government policy that the purpose of the levy is 3 million apprenticeship starts. By 2020. I mean, that's impossible. It will never not happen. It's a suspiciously round figure. I have no idea what it's based on. Plucked out of the air. No government minister I've heard use that phrase or that as the aim for a good year or so. So, even though it's technically that is the purpose, it's been forgotten, and rightly so. It should not be about numbers, it should be about quality. But so, yeah, until the clarity is there on how the system is working, where the money is being spent, and what are we trying to achieve, I think there will always be these tensions that will be unanswered.
Okay, thank you.
We're going to move on to some questions now from Dr. Onka Sahota. Onka.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the word quality. Do you feel that this shift to the standards has been an effective way of improving the quality of apprenticeships?
Yeah, I can't say that in every circumstance that will be the case, but on the whole, the feedback that we get from members in our surveys and various meetings is the shift from frameworks to standards has led to an increase in quality, mainly for the fact that each standard is designed by employers. Trailblazer group employers come together, design the content, design the format, and actually have a real purpose, and they tend to be people in the sector in that apprenticeship. So yeah, the drive to quality is certainly there.
And is it being externally assessed at the end of it, or who does the assessment at the end?
Yeah, so the endpoint assessment is an issue that does come up. Often too late really to do something about it. So there is a lack of assessors. It can be quite difficult. Different parts of the country have different levels. It can also be a sort of a cost that isn't always thought about entirely. And there are anecdotal examples of where the assessment isn't potentially appropriate for the apprenticeship going on. There are examples that have been given around a very hand-based apprenticeship, very hand skills based, and then the assessment is an exam or a written task or whatever it might be. So a mismatch there. So on the endpoint assessments, this is something that the Institute for Apprenticeships oversees and looks at. I think there's certainly more that could be done to make sure that they're appropriate, there are assessors in place, and there's a cost that's definitely included in the actual apprenticeship provision.
Maintaining quality has been a problem so far, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few issues. Yeah, there are always going to be issues with this. So the quality, I would say, has increased significantly.
Right.
But that does cause tensions naturally. So if you increase the quality, you've increased the cost, which we've covered, but you also have the potential to over-specialise an apprenticeship standard. So rather than an apprenticeship being quite generic and broad, you can get to the point where it's very domain-specific. It's, you are going down one track to one job. And that's not, I don't think, a particularly good way for a standard to be set up, especially as if it's very specific, incredibly detailed, it becomes out of date incredibly quickly. And when you look at sectors like digital or very innovative sectors where the content is constantly changing, actually having a really specific, overly prescriptive standard can loosen and the ability to have flexibility in the content goes.
A briefing says that despite assurances that the quality of apprentices has improved since the reforms put in place, Ofsted has highlighted that improvements have stalled, with only 60% of reviewed apprenticeship providers delivering good or better service than over the last year. It does remain a challenge, especially with the proliferation of all these providers coming forward.
Yeah. I would say, again, a little bit like with careers advice, we're at quite a low point and we're now on the upward. So it's not perfect and there's a lot to be done, and a lot of my job is about trying to engage our members in T-level design, into apprenticeship trailblazer groups, and try to engage them as much more as possible to try and continue this improvement. So yeah, I would agree that we're not there yet, and more will have to be done.
Okay. Jules, the Skills for London's framework highlights the Mayor's desire to see quantity and quality of apprenticeships in London. Given these issues relating to the explosion of apprenticeships, training providers, what can you or your team do to ensure that we are delivering good quality apprenticeships in London, given the challenges we face?
Well, certainly we're working a lot, we'll be working a lot with colleges. We have established a team of people here at City Hall that will engage with colleges in a way that the SFA weren't able to in latter years. And I mean, one good example is the Mayor's Construction Academy, where we have brought together employers as well as training providers, as well as councils and others, that will aim specifically about raising the standard of apprenticeships and consistency, that will specifically to satisfy, as well as raise numbers, but specifically also to satisfy the quality needed by industry, because again, there's something a huge variability in training historically, a certain degree of mistrust, some of it justified in some of the training offered. So we need to cut through that, because we need the numbers of good quality construction apprentices in London and in fact nationally. We're also working with the Association of Training Providers as well, to sector by sector. Obviously there are ones that we're concentrating up front. Michelle mentioned some of them. Obviously retail and hospitality and social care are ones that are kind of foremost in our mind at the moment.
Just in addition to that, so some of my team work exclusively on apprenticeships, on both the policy but also working with those providers that are delivering them. Through the Skills for Londoners Board, we have members of both the AOC and the Association of Learning Providers, who are the majority of providers of apprenticeships. And we also have an apprenticeship subgroup, which again, I believe you're part of, is looking at quality amongst a range of other things about how can we increase apprenticeships, how can we deliver them better. I have regular conversations with the Association of Learning Providers. We meet at least quarterly and discuss a range of issues, but apprenticeships and the quality of those does come up. We're also exploring some other activity that we could perhaps work with them on, specifically around apprenticeships.
And do you keep a list of all the apprenticeship providers in London?
We don't. However, the Education and Skills Funding Agency does have that list.
So there is a list existing.
No, whether they have partitioned that by London, I imagine it's probably a national list. I would have to check for you, but that is available on their website. So
Can you let us know if the list is available of London providers?
We can certainly.
And who's keeping quality assurance checks on them?
It wouldn't. So that is definitely not the Mayor of London's role. That the quality assurance isn't our role.
Whose role is that?
So Ofsted play a significant role in that, and the Education and Skills Funding Agency who fund that. What we can do is certainly we can see if that list is available publicly, and if it's not available publicly, then we can certainly ask them for that.
Great, thank you, Rich.
Can I just ask you, would it be possible to share the membership of the Apprenticeship subgroup with us?
Yep.
That would be great if perhaps if you could send that to us afterwards.
Yep.
And I saw Sean wanted to come in now on this section as well.
Just a quick one, Nick. So you are a real business, you do real things. When you look at the assessment that the apprentices have to go to, does it make any sense to you? Do you think, yes, I like what they're asking this apprentice? Does anybody ask real businesses what they actually want as an end result?
I think the change to the standard is definitely a good thing, because the tick boxes certainly wasn't working from the kind of NVQs and that kind of process. So yeah, so I'm hopeful for the future of things with the standard.
I suppose the question is, if I was a kid from Manchester and I came down and I had my apprenticeship certificate, would you value that? Would you accept me knowing what you know about apprenticeships, having put your own young people through them?
Well, I suppose actually the thing with the construction industry is you get someone on site and you get them to do stuff, because everyone is a master of whatever they do and has their various different qualifications, and they're varying different skill levels. So it's really how you applied yourself, and whether you just scrape through or whether you're really passionate about being or whatever it is, and you've really sort of picked up everything you can in the process, or whether you have just ticked the boxes to get the qualification. So we just look at a person and we say, right, go and do something or another, and while they're doing that, you say, well, have you not hung a door before? Or have you, yes,
we're going to come back to a focus on the construction industry sector, and it's 11:15, and we've still got quite a lot more section of questions to go through. So if you want to hold that and bring that back in when we get to the construction industry sector. We're going to move on now to two lots of areas of questioning around equality of access. So moving on from quality to equality of access, we're going to come to Assemblymember Jeanette Arnold, who's going to ask some questions around the challenges facing people from black and minority ethnic communities and their access to apprenticeships and training. Jeanette.
Yes, Chair, thank you. I'm just going to use the terminology black and minority heritage, because I think that then speaks to a wider population, because some of the children we're talking about now are third generation Londoners and don't identify themselves as BAME. We might identify them by skin colour as BAME, but even that, depending on their relationships, is a dodgy area. So let me just start, and if I can start with you, Michelle. In 2017, this committee identified in its report apprenticeships and on-level playing field, many of the challenges that there were. In 2018, the House of Commons Education Committee, in their report, the apprenticeship ladder of opportunity, quality, not quantity, recognised many of the same challenges. So for apprenticeships or apprentices of BAME heritage, and it's worthwhile knowing that these same challenges apply to young people from socially disadvantaged groups, whether they be travellers, whether they be in low income, homeless, and the like. So has the Mayor, through your team, Michelle, implemented any of the recommendations that the committee made in 2017? And if you were called to give evidence to the House of Commons Education Committee, what actions have you taken from their report?
Right, I'm going to have to be honest that I cannot explicitly remember the recommendations in there, but I can talk broadly about what we've done around...
From our report, I can tell you them.
Okay, that would be helpful. Sorry, I don't have those in front of me.
Okay. The Mayor should advise setting a purely numerical target for apprenticeships, but instead focus on quality rather than quantity, because the quantity tick box you can meet for apprenticeships of Lane Heritage, because they will be in the lower level order of skills. So we were looking there for quality.
So certainly, I mean, as you outlined there, actually London does better than our counterparts in attracting BAME students into apprenticeships. So around 45% of our apprentices in London come from those backgrounds. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be doing significantly more than we already are doing. We have, or the Mayor signed up to be part of the 5 Cities project.
Is that for quality apprenticeships or just
Well,
in
I would
general?
hope it's quality. We, as we've sort of spoken about before, we're certainly working with those providers of apprentices as well as the various government bodies to increase that quality. The work of the apprenticeship subgroup that we mentioned earlier through the Skills for Londoners Board is certainly looking at quality as well as diversity in apprenticeships in their kind of remit. As I was sort of going on to say, the Mayor signed up in February to the National 5 Cities project, where we will be working with other cities. So we'll be working with Manchester, Bristol, Birmingham and Leicester on increasing BAME representation in apprenticeships over the period.
So when did you sign up to that?
We signed up to that in February 2018, and we are working with the various cities to increase BAME representation to around 20% by 2020. Now, in London, we've already hit that, so we need to be increasing that further.
So before you leave that, what positive action is that? What does that mean, other than your meeting with, talking with?
The project is sort of ongoing. I haven't been specifically involved in that. My team are working on that, so we can give you more of the details around what that involves. But the aim of that is certainly to increase those. We're also doing a number of other things that we've sort of mentioned throughout this. So the London Progression programme that we mentioned earlier around apprenticeships, we talked about that around social mobility, and again increasing BAME representation within apprenticeships. Our digital talent programme again focuses specifically on digital. But that again has a focus on women and particularly young people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds to get them engaged in those sectors.
And given that, I'm just going to hurry you along, given that we know and we've heard John speak of it, the poor state of careers advice, again in 2017 we recommended that the Mayor should push for independent careers advice as it was through a London perspective that we could actually then go to those areas and localities that we know about and then do the work specifically in those areas. What action's been taken about that?
So we continue to push for the devolution of careers advice. That is something that has not gone away, and we even probably about a month ago we met with Anne Milton, the Minister for Skills, and again spoke about the need. In fact, all of the Metro mayors that were present at that meeting really were very pushing very hard on devolution of careers advice to the localities to help deliver some of this.
I think the Minister feels that because localities are consulted on the contents of that, then therefore it is sufficiently shaped for our purposes as opposed to being devolved in us.
And I think when we say consulted, that's very loose.
Okay. And I mean,
can I just ask you, is the devolution of careers advice, I mean, obviously we've talked about the problems and issues, is that something that the 5 cities are working on and all agree with, plus the other devolved administrations?
Yeah, so we have quite a lot of conversations around careers advice. I think it was fairly universal in the room, but there was some very vocal push for
Has
devolution.
there been a sort of
careers.
joint letter or anything like that you could share with us?
Yeah,
Perhaps you could
joint
send
lobbying.
that to us so that we can see that, you know, that you're definitely I'm sure you are pushing on this, but it would be good for us to be able to see, you know, that if there's been any reply as well.
Yeah, the other thing that we're doing around that is obviously comprehensive spending review, whether that happens or not. But certainly we're working with our counterparts again on joint lines, particularly around skills and transport. On the skills issue, in particular, we are mentioning careers advice, that universally all of those devolved authorities are seeking devolved
Thank you. Sorry for
advice.
poaching into your questions.
No, that was, I'll tick that off my list. The follow-on from that is we're all aware that we're shortly to hear who's going to be leader of the Conservative Party and therefore the Prime Minister. Are you able to make any links with anything that they have said and see that as encouraging? I know that one of them spoke about monies for education. Was that just money from education generally, or did anybody drill down into skills?
There's a little bit to go in that contest, so the bidding war perhaps hasn't finished yet about who's going to spend more on these things. So.
Right, so everybody's made some sort of statement, so it's something that can be followed up, whoever wins the contest.
And of course, the current most likely candidate, who was formerly of this place, was a keen advocate for fiscal devolution when he was here. So
Yes,
I'm looking forward
yes.
to that being followed through if he was successful in becoming Prime Minister.
Yeah. Well, we have him on record a number of occasions of doing that, so we will be happy to share any information that we have with you. Then, can I just then go to Andre? And I'm sorry, I don't know where your business is located.
South London.
South London.
Yes.
South London. So that's the black and minority ethnic young people there, sort of large in numbers. So what is your experience about the challenges there's been in order to get them to take up apprenticeships?
I don't really have any experience, to be honest.
Right, you haven't recruited any apprenticeships, never, no. No, they don't like the construction industry.
No, we've employed all sorts of different people from different backgrounds, but haven't had any apprentices yet. We're just dealing with that at the moment.
Oh, okay, thank you for that. And then we've heard, and we keep hearing, and I'm sure I could write your answer. But what more do we need to do? And I understand what you're saying, Michelle. The London numbers are better than most, but that really doesn't help me when I go out to speak to the young people who find themselves being channeled into a system that pays them less than £4 an hour, and they see themselves as just really chattels and don't see a future. So what more can we really do?
There's things that we have in train, and I think a lot of this comes back down to careers advice and kind of opening up of those opportunities and enabling young people, particularly from BAME backgrounds, who perhaps the evidence we have shows that they aren't receiving the advice and guidance that gives them the depth and breadth of different sectors. There is a significant piece of work around that careers advice. As Jules mentioned, the enterprise advisors are one step towards that. And the fact that we have been able to put an enterprise advisor into every school, secondary school and college in London that has wanted one. The working together with partners like CBI and London First, again, to encourage their involvement in things like Skills London. Also, the Knowledge Hub, which hasn't been mentioned today at all, we have just gone out to consultation on that, and that we're hoping will be a sort of portal for information, advice and guidance, whether that's actually for business or for individuals, and we're seeking the results of that consultation to see how we further develop that, but really to start to bring together those careers paths and enable young people to access that information. A lot of the information is there, it's very hard to bring together.
Okay, it's just two quick questions. We've heard a lot about the enterprise advisors. Again, absolutely, I totally support that. Meeting people who are part of work and them, coming in to talk to you, that's great. I remember way back being encouraged to go into nursing because I met, well, actually, I had no choice. My mother said I was going to be a nurse, if I'm honest. But I was encouraged to stay with it because I met inspirational nurses who were always ahead of me, and I wanted to be like them. I have to say, what also inspired me was that many of them were black like myself. So if you're going to put enterprise advisors into predominant, in areas where there's a predominant black BAME young people and they're white, is that going to work?
You said they don't see themselves as
Well, I'm not aware that they're predominantly white. I mean, I think all the programs that we engage with, everyone's very mindful of reflecting the community that one wants to engage with, and I think everyone is mindful that it is about role models.
Right, okay. Well, no, that's a good answer to the question. And the last one is about data. Going back to our 27th report, we asked the Mayor to direct and I know it's not you, but it would help your work, the London Economic Action Partnership, the LEAP, to publish annual London-specific data, which includes the number of apprenticeship starts with success rates broken down by gender, ethnicity, disability, age, sector and qualifications. Has that happened, and have you seen the result of that?
That isn't our data, nor is it the LEAP's data, so that is the ESFA and the DFE's data. I understand they do publish high-level data on that, and that is publicly available. We can certainly go back and I'll have a look to check what is publicly available, and we can give that to you if it is there.
Not for me, it's to influence the work that you're doing, because it's always said that you don't have enough data for this, data for that. That was said in 27, and I've still heard bits of it this morning. So I'm saying one of our recommendations was to look at a body that could commission and publish that sort of data. Have you seen that data? Do you think that would be useful data to have?
We do have partial amounts of data, but again, as we don't own the data, we can only request that data. Part of the issues that we have across, not just apprenticeships, across any kind of further education type activity, is the levels of transparency. And actually, even when we do receive some of that data, the ability for us then to give that to third parties or to publish it ourselves. So this is an ongoing kind of discussion with colleagues in the departments about what can we publish, what can we use. It's a very live debate at the moment, given that the Mayor will be receiving the adult education budget from the 1st of August, who owns that data and up to what level we can publish that information. There are certainly high-level statistical releases that the government do across apprenticeships and across other funding streams, which are publicly available, but it depends on the depth and level of that information.
Okay, John, did I see you wanting to come in?
Yeah, all I was going to say was that I think it's a really important question, and while sort of diversity inclusion policy doesn't come under me at the CBI, social mobility and social justice is something that is the question I ask for every single bit of work that we do. And in this area, it's a really, really important question. We take a slightly broader definition, I suppose, of social justice. I guess we expand it out into other groups like special educational needs, socioeconomics, ethnicity. We take a quite broad view, and each of these groups is sort of poorly served in some way. And our partnership with the Careers and Enterprise Company is a direct reaction to that, and we are specifically trying to address these issues. So in London specifically, one of the issues is a mismatch of demand and supply of employers getting involved in education. So the stereotype always is that schools and colleges and Tower Hamlets will have lawyers and bankers queuing up to help, and often their problem is saying, please go away, you're overwhelming us, and you don't need to go far out into an outer borough like Barking or whatever. And they're desperate to get employers involved. So we're working with the Careers and Enterprise Company to try and actually talk to our members and say, it's amazing you want to get involved, it's amazing you want to help, but have you thought about this place? It's not next door, but it's further out, and it's serving these communities that are poorly served. And you're right as well on the messenger is incredibly important on all of this, and actually making sure that young people get careers advice from people that they associate with is incredibly important. And then finally, I would argue that going back again to primary school is so important in this. You know, just doing all what I just described at secondary school is almost a bit too late. A lot of that entrenched disadvantage is there by the age of 11. The disadvantage gap, which is about 2 years, so the gap between disadvantaged young people, which free school meals is the definition, and then more advantaged peers, that's 2 years at the age of 16. About 60% of that disadvantage gap is in by 11. So you've lost it at that point. So a lot of our work will be about how do we get businesses to go to places they've not thought of before that need the most help? How do we make enterprise advisors look like the people in the classes they're talking to and make sure they connect? But also working with the Careers Enterprise Company to try and develop gaps to benchmarks in primary. I'm a governor of a special educational needs school, so it's sort of a passion of mine. You know, actually, you know, special educational needs, you know, people with special educational needs will have careers and will have lives. You know,
don't get me going on special educational needs.
And yet, you know, we don't have gaps of benchmarks for that group and a huge other group. So trying to develop what high quality careers advice and making sure all those options are available to as many people as possible is absolutely.
In programmes that will be commissioned for them and paid for by the Mayor's adult education budget or other funding, as I understand it. So some good work around. Thank you.
Wanted to come in just very briefly.
Very tiny thing. John partly answered, but I don't think he answered Jeanette's question properly. What have you done specifically for these groups that are far away, BAME groups we've used from being involved in apprenticeship in London? And also, I challenge the London numbers. Are they actually better when it comes to BAME? Because, of course, we have a much bigger BAME pool to recruit from in the first place. So are you comparing like with like?
Just for the record, I was satisfied with the answers that I've
well,
got.
I wasn't. I don't
Otherwise,
feel like
I would have drilled down further.
Sorry,
Thank
excuse
you.
me. Then I don't. John gave a very good example.
So, can we, John, would you like to answer Sean's question?
Well, no, I feel like John did give a specific answer. I'm more directing this to the GLA, to the Mayor's office. What has specifically been done to engage groups, particularly BAME groups, that have low representation in these apprenticeships? I didn't feel like someone had told me something that we're doing.
Is there something that you would like to contribute, either Jules or Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, these, focus on BAME groups is a specific ambition of projects. It's explicitly stated, whether it's the Mayor's Construction Academy, whether it's the Digital Talent Pipeline Programme, whether it's the Work in 5 Cities that have been mentioned, engaging and drawing in underrepresented groups to engage in that training is front and centre.
There's a great difference between it being stated, people signing up, to what's being done differently. Targets will be set, expectations will be set for within those programmes. I mean, I don't oversee those programmes directly, so I can't give you the kind of the operational way in which the commissioned providers go about it. But I mean, they are tasked with that within those programmes.
Can I ask you something, which I wanted to come to on this area as well, just to follow on from Jeanette. We were talking about starters, and you were saying that the number of starters is better in London than perhaps in other areas. But one of the things that our report in 2017 noticed was that BAME heritage apprentices tend to be clustered in the low-level, low-paid apprenticeships. So something specific that you're doing to tackle that would be very helpful to know. And also that more than a quarter of BAME heritage apprentices fail to finish the training, and those achievement rates are continuing to drop. The reasons for this are poorly understood. Is your apprenticeships subgroup working on either addressing any of those issues? And I think that speaks really to what Sean is asking. I think some specifics here. It's no good having a large number of people from BAME heritage going into apprenticeships if they're then stuck in the worst ones and also they then don't complete them. Is there anything that's being done?
We've done, off the top of my head, I can't recall that we've done anything specifically around apprenticeships on that. We have certainly done a piece of work around higher education in particular, around why the the completion rate of BAME candidates is actually less and the is higher, and the dropout rate is higher. And there is a report that we have now published which goes into quite some detail. The findings are really interesting. It's not necessarily about ethnicity, actually, which is what we thought it was. It's about a range of other support that isn't there perhaps for some of those individuals, and certainly we can share that report with you. That's certainly around higher education. Now, some of these apprentices are in higher education, so it kind of fits across both. I will go back to the team and ask if we've done something specific around...
I think that would be very helpful. If you could share that report with us, we'd
report.
Appreciate that. Also, we will write to you with some comments, obviously, after today, and that may include a suggestion that perhaps the apprenticeship subgroup should consider the issue particularly about dropping out. But at this point, I'm now going to move on to the next section of questioning.
Just one.
Well, hang on.
I haven't finished, and you jumped in, because it's very well signing up to these things. We'd like some detail on what change that are being done. What are you asking these providers to do? And the reason I ask that is because, as has been alluded to, if you help people from BAME backgrounds, you tend to be helping everybody across the piece. Because just because you're black doesn't mean you suffer some new alien issues. It tends to be the issues that all human beings would suffer, and there's extra value in doing that work. And I still don't feel like I heard any specific detail about what is being done differently. I accept that you may need to go back and look at that, but it does need looking at, because there's a huge difference between an ambition and a target and impact on the ground, and that's the point I want to be registered, and that you pursue that piece of work, please.
Okay, that wasn't a question. I'd like to move on to Caroline, if you don't mind, because
we'll come back with the implementation detail.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so I want to look at the barriers that women face. Women are underrepresented in the construction industry. There's just 4.2% of starts by women in engineering. And women tend to be older as well going into apprenticeships. And women are overrepresented, just as BAME people are, in low-paid health and social care and childcare type apprentices. And on pay, unequal pay is much worse for women. So we've got a table of pay in our briefing which shows the sort of difference 1 year after an apprenticeship finishes and then 5 years after completion. And there's a gender pay gap to start with, and it just grows, and it's, you know, it's pretty shocking, particularly in building construction, where it was, you know, men would get 19,500, women 18,300 1 year after, but 5 years after, the men are on 26,800 and the women are on 18,600. So, you know, these pay gaps are significant, and the pay of people in child development and well-being, you know, 5 years later, is the men are on 16,000 and the women are on 13,000. You know, it's but we know that there are many, many more women working in child development and well-being and those kind of those lower paid areas. So I think my sort of opening question is really, what is the relationship between gender application success and the other underlying variables on these apprenticeship schemes, and you know, why is it that women are kind of getting a pretty rough deal?
I mean, well, clearly that there are issues to do with apprenticeships, as there are across the whole world of work, and the barriers placed in front of women, particularly, you know, returning to work. Particularly after childcare, the lack of comprehensive childcare in this country, lack of affordable childcare. We're working with, also the lack of, and we're working with employers and providers, training providers on this one. The current lack of flexible and part-time apprenticeships as well, which obviously would be more attractive to mothers looking to return to work. I mean, that's mine.
I think
start?
I think this is probably wider than just apprenticeships, isn't it? It's far wider. It's something that we are certainly acutely aware of when we look at skills and employment across the piece. In London, again, we do relatively well around apprenticeships, as in 56% of those that undertake an apprenticeship are women. But you're right, obviously, then the pay gap that then comes later, there are significant issues that still need to be tackled. Some of the things we are doing, not just on apprenticeships, but across the broader skills piece, we have sort of ESF programs that we are have just procured, which are looking at supporting particularly parents back into work. What are the support mechanisms there? We will shortly, or the Mayor will shortly be launching something called the Skills Innovation Fund, which again is asking providers to come forward with proposals for innovative solutions to some of the barriers. One of those barriers being childcare and flexibility of training to fit in with perhaps work-life balance and everything else within that. So we're very aware there's a significant number of issues that we need to tackle on this.
I think there's also the issue of the living wage. All apprentices here at City Hall are paid the London living wage, which is really good. But that's absolutely not the case across the piece, and even living wage accredited employers are able to pay less than the living wage and less than the London living wage for apprentices. Do you think that that is something that needs to change?
Yeah, I mean, that is the Mayor's Good Work Standard does expect employers to pay at the London living wage for apprentices, and as has been discussed in the Chamber today, it's could very, although it is a challenge, and we recognise it as a challenge for employers, £3.94 or whatever it is clearly a disincentive to people taking on some of these roles.
And may perhaps be having an impact on the dropout rates as well, and the sort of lack of completion. There's some really worrying statistics that I've seen from the Young Women's Trust, which says, for example, that 84% of apprentices said they faced a significant financial challenge, and 6 in 10, that's 60%, also said that they struggled to make cash last until the end of the month. 1 in 5 apprentices had skipped meals, 1 in 6 had become overdrawn, 1 in 10 had gone into arrears on their rent. So this seems to be more severe for women, with 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men, so 30% of women, 21% of men, saying they'd been forced to borrow money from friends or family to make their cash last. So not only do we increase awareness so that more women. So how do we make apprenticeships more attractive to women when they are facing these really tricky circumstances around how they literally just get through week to week? Surviving financially.
Well, as I say, I mean, there's the issue of the basic pay. There's transport costs. There's, I say, childcare and cost of childcare is probably one of the biggest barriers if they are returns to work. And as I said about the flexibility as well of both the working hours and the flexibility of the apprenticeship, the structure of the apprenticeship and the training.
And do you think that there's an issue? I mean, we heard earlier about the how a lot of the levy money is being used for the kind of the more degree type apprenticeships. Do you think that that is an issue in terms of making sure that the lower level apprenticeships are properly resourced and are delivering a decent experience for the people taking part?
Yes, I mean, and it's likely to increase, to get worse as well. And I think the funding of the lower level apprenticeships, I mean, we want to see good quality apprenticeships, but clearly there needs to be there's a progression. I mean, one of the things that we've strongly lobbied for is the fact that some of the an element of levy funds should be available, and ideally under a devolved system. But regardless of who holds the purse strings, a small element of the levy funds should be made available for sort of very basic entry-level work to make people apprenticeable, because you know that there are many schemes are run that put people in front of employers to be taken on, and they are not ready. They are neither necessarily employable nor indeed apprenticeable. And I say that so those, the system has to recognise the readiness, the job readiness, the apprentice readiness of men, women, all ages that need to enter the system, and help guide. So we've talked about guidance. Yes, we need guidance, but actually, once they're actually, at the on the very bottom rung, they might need the kinds of support that are currently not in sufficient supply and not become just another one of these statistics that's the dropouts that we were referring to before. It needs to be a comprehensive support package.
I can just come in on there. If you were to uninvent everything we're talking about and do this again, you would implement T-levels first and then the apprenticeship levy, because what we're sort of stumbling around here is that at the lower end there's a missing element, and that is the T-level, which sits after GCSEs, which is the step onto an apprenticeship potentially. It's, as you describe it, sort of making someone apprenticeable. A T-level should play that role, but obviously full rollouts of 2023. So we're a long way away from that. So we're sort of a bit of an interim period, because a T-level will be roughly 80% training, 20% on a placement, whereas apprenticeships, the reverse. It's the 20% off the job bit is the training, and then the on-job is 80%. So once T-levels are in place, and there's that really high quality technical education post-GCSEs, that's the stepping off point. You could do a T-level, you get a very broad, very high quality training, and then you consider an apprenticeship potentially. But of course, T-level can also lead to a bachelor's degree in university. It will carry UCAS points. So again, to go back to, we shouldn't try and say that two tracks, an academic and a technical route. That's just not the case. You can do academic, swap over to technical, and vice versa. But on your other points about women specifically, that group, I would just reiterate the early intervention point. Again, gender stereotyping in what is a girl's subject or boy's subject or whatever it might be, they take hold at primary, and they're very hard to tackle later on, and they influence choices. So the more we can intervene early and make sure actually we have age-appropriate careers advice in primary school, which is often just a woman going in to a primary school taking an assembly and actually saying that maths is for girls. It's not a boys' subject. How a ridiculous concept. If you tackle it then, you've done it. And then there is the other area of tackling stereotypes about workplaces. If you say to somebody, an apprenticeship in manufacturing, the image that conjures is a sort of dirty, sort of almost Dickensian type vision of a workplace, and that's just not the case. Most manufacturing is to an almost clinical cleanliness. It is incredibly high tech, incredibly modern, but those stereotypes of what manufacturing is or what construction is, they're so out of date with what the reality is, and they can put off groups who don't particularly want to go down that stereotype. So whatever we can do in social media, in careers advice, in our own sort of external exposure to tackle those stereotypes can have an immense impact.
Do you not think, though, that with these T-level, the sort of T-level step, that there's still going to be the same gender disparity, and that there's a risk that you just end up with a lot of young men going into those, and if the other issues aren't sorted out around it, that will just bake in more inequality?
Absolutely, that would be unacceptable. If we just entrenched it even more, that would be a bad outcome all round. So the earlier we can intervene, the earlier you can tackle stereotypes, the earlier you can demonstrate that every subject is for everyone, and the sort of the kind of the workplace and the options you go down are wrong, the better. But yeah, you're right. If T-levels entrench it further, that will not be acceptable.
Yeah, before it's too late, T-levels have got to be established as something, not as something that boys who have failed to get GCSE maths take.
Yeah.
It's got to be, and now has got to be the time that the DfE's got to act.
Yeah. Are there any examples of positive action that could be put in place to support women in apprenticeships, and that's things that are actually doable, because obviously there are, in a perfect world we'd supply childcare and free transport and everything else, but that's not the case. So what are there things that could be done?
Similar to our response to Sean's question, we can come back perhaps with some of the actual implementation detail, but the programs that I mentioned earlier about Construction Academy and the digital skills program, getting young women into those sectors, just to say that as much emphasis is put on to women as much as BAME candidates and any disadvantaged groups. It's all about getting under a key thrust of them is about getting underrepresented groups into those sectors, as well as generally raising the numbers, because whether it's construction, whether it's digital, whether it's social care, whether it's hospitality, all these in London, we need all these new entrants to come into those areas of work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, I want to ask some questions about one of the sectors that you just mentioned, Jules, and about making sure that we have got sufficient numbers of people skilled up. And obviously this speaks to other parts of your brief other than the skills part, but the planning and the regen area. A lot of the construction in the UK is in London, but even with 20% of new contracts being awarded for work in London, we only had just over 3,000 people participating in construction apprenticeships. Now, I know, because I've been on a lot of building sites, that some people have come from other countries because the health and safety signage isn't just in English, it's in other languages as well. So, with the obvious issue of Brexit and people potentially going away who are currently working on construction sites, are apprenticeships the way to meeting what could be a big and growing skills gap? Because also a lot of people working in construction are older people as well. And I wondered if I could start with Nick first of all. Do you feel apprenticeships are able to address that? Is there a skills gap that we perceive that it's going to be a problem coming down the pipe, possibly because people are going away, possibly because people are retiring because they're older? Could you share your thoughts with us on that?
Yeah, there's absolutely a massive skills gap.
Massive skills gap.
Massive skills gap. Yes, and it's because all the properly trained people are coming to retirement age, and also Brexit's having an effect. I suppose when the whole skills gap has been masked, if you like, when Poland joined the EU, because we had a big influx of skilled and unskilled workers into the construction
The not
industry.
so mythical Polish plumber.
The not so mythical, yeah. And and so that has that kind of masked the skills crisis that we're approaching now, I suppose. And literally, forget about, the issue is Brexit, but the change in the value of the pound for anyone who doesn't live here and who's sending money abroad has already cut their wages by whatever it is, 10-20%. So they're already thinking, okay, there's hostility here and we don't know there's uncertainty. So that is a big kind of shift with the kind of migrant labour that's here to kind of move away from here. So it's I think the kind of the T levels that are coming, it all makes sense, and it's all kind of born out of this major issue that we've got. And apprenticeships are definitely a part of that, and seeing the kind of vocational qualifications as a sort of as a good thing to do, as a good career. Certainly, all of these issues is driving up the pay for construction workers because of the skills gap.
So T levels slightly sooner than 2023 would be helpful?
Well, exactly. It's interesting. I suppose, I don't know if it's like this in other industries, but in quite a few businesses in the construction industry, let's say my plastering subcontractor, they don't have any apprentices, but they take on labourers and the clever labourers learn from the master. So in theory they're apprenticeships, but they're not kind of official apprenticeships. But the ones who are interested in what the plasterer's doing, and one day they get to do a bit because they're a bit behind, and they start learning like that. It's interesting that their business, they don't have an issue at the moment because of that, because people are kind of going through their business, whereas our electricians, it's quite an interesting time at the moment. It used to be a few years ago, all the management, I would be on the phone and I would be talking to everyone, and I wouldn't see them. And I'd see the guys on site who are coming to actually do the work. These days, because of the skills shortage, we're meeting all of the sort of the masters, if you like, are coming back down to site because they haven't got the skilled people to deliver the work, and they're picking their work as well. So you cherry pick your work. It's a bizarre situation, and it's a situation for the kind of end user that must be scaring people away from building work, certainly, and we see it throughout the whole sort of supply chain as well, where mistakes happen through the supply chain because they haven't got the skilled people doing what they were doing 10 years ago. So it's a big issue, and everything has to be sort of pushed, as it is being pushed now, to resolve it, I guess.
So a huge skills gap. Apprenticeships at the moment only helping with about 3,000 people going into construction. A mayoral target, luckily for you, the Deputy Mayor for Housing, 66,000 units a year. We're in a desperate situation. What can be done to ramp up in terms of not just housing starts, but also getting people skilled onto the tools, toolbox talks, all of those things are going to die out if all these people leave the construction sector, aren't they?
I think Brexit is making it much worse, but even if that hadn't happened, we ought to have been training people up, particularly because of the loss of people through ageing workforce. That's why the Mayor committed to creating the Mayor's Construction Academy. It's got a number of key planks, 4 key planks, improve the supply of skilled workers that the industry needs, inspire and enable more Londoners, particularly women and BAME groups, to develop the skills that they need to get into the sector and then progress in the sector. It's about intensifying collaboration between SMEs and training providers. And finally, it's about developing, bringing forward more training provision in sort of new sectors, precision manufacturing, which obviously the Housing Committee and Planning Committee obviously pay a lot of attention to. And so to deliver on that, it's got, again, a number of work streams to deliver on those 4 key outcomes. The first stage was bringing forward the quality mark, and that identifies the high quality training, construction, the training provision that's out there. And we've got 21 skills providers that have got that accreditation now in London.
Are you able to give us a list of those?
Yeah, we can give you those.
That'd be helpful.
And then the next plank of it was to create hubs where bringing those training providers together with most of whom are colleges, but not all, but with small businesses, the larger businesses, the Lend-Leases, the British Lands, all those big construction firms, and local authorities. And that was about increasing the coordination and, as I say, getting around that problem where even if you had some training from a college, there might have been some suspicion by construction firms of the quality or relevance of that, and that usual thing about, and not just in construction, this goes elsewhere, you've heard it before, we took on somebody from college, but we started from scratch training them, whether that's in IT or construction, and it was trying to get round that and making sure that what the colleges are doing is what the construction industry wants. Then there's a third strand to it is capital funding. and a chunk of the skills capital funding was ring-fenced specifically for investment in the training providers that were working within the hubs. And actually, to secure that funding, you actually, going back to my first point of the first plank, you have to be receive the MCA quality mark. We're not going to put money into poor quality provision. And then finally, there's the careers campaign that is there. And so there's a sort of a marketing and communications push to sort of direct people to good quality careers, advice and learning opportunities. And of course, construction is a big theme. We want to see construction being a big theme within that advice.
So would you say that this is starting to bear fruit yet, or would you say that we're still at early stages? And if we're still at early stages, when will it bear fruit?
It is at the early stages. The hubs have been in place now about 6 months. I think whilst we're going to want to look backwards and quantify how it's done, I think at the moment, because of the imperative to get numbers up, we just need to do it. I don't think it's a case of, hanging around further and piloting, and I think we just need to crack on. I think none of the things that I've outlined are things that will disincentivise or put up barriers. So it's more a case of cracking on with it and then judging effectiveness and how things need to be altered or added to make them deliver more and faster.
I think given the urgency of the situation as described by Nick at the beginning of my questions, and I think it's the demographic change is the big impact here, obviously with the overlay of other issues as well. I do think cracking on and not running pilots is absolutely the way forward.
I mean, and I think, we've talked about sort of the quality of provision, and that is a big part of it. But so often in today's conversation, as we do elsewhere, we come back to the importance of coordination and advice and guidance to young, people of all ages, frankly. And that's the gradual collapse of that over many, many years, and the importance of that when it was with schools and other bodies that contributed, and to it's a fraction of what it was. And I think that a lot of what we're doing now ends up filling in for what used to be there, which I think makes a powerful case for perhaps as a nation kind of rethinking about the importance of careers advice and guidance in all its forms, in all the bodies that could contribute to it, and actually giving a stronger national framework in its provision.
And in the public consciousness, making sure that technical and vocational is seen to be absolutely equal to anything else. Nick, did you stick your hand up and want to come back in?
I guess the reason I'm here is because SMEs really should be playing a key role in this, and we're all kind of scared of the financial implications and how do we approach it. The FMB has prepared this, a few years ago, diffusing skills time by boosting apprenticeship training through construction SMEs. I think I was sort of trying to get my head around it yesterday, and it's kind of tackles a lot of these issues, and it's quite an interesting document.
Well, perhaps we could circulate that document to the members of the committee. That sounds as though that would be useful in terms of our deliberations. Did you want to add something as well, John?
All I was going to add was that this is all my job is meeting CEOs and managing directors and trying to understand their problems, and it never takes very long for skill shortages to come up, and that is compounded by the fact we have record employment, record youth employment. So not only are there skill shortages, but actually it's an incredibly tight labour market. There aren't that many people turning over. So the result of that is that employers and business now members say they are planning to increase how much they spend on skills. At the moment, it's about 44 billion a year, which is more than the DfE schools budget. And in all of our surveys, it comes out very clear that the prediction is over the next 12 months or 18 months that will increase more and more to address this exact issue. And one thing that hasn't come up today is college funding. If there was a part of the education system that I would point to that's creaking the most financially, it is colleges, and this was identified by the Education Secretary himself as the part. So as part of our spending review campaign this year will be around needing to end the financial neglect of colleges, because when you neglect colleges financially, the sorts of activities that will have to be pared back or drop off are things like outreach.
It's slightly straying into the territory of our education committee, which is why we've not really asked you so much.
The link to this discussion
that
is that those sort of outreach activities are to disadvantaged groups like BAME and women, but also to harder to reach employers like SMEs. So when college funding is pressured,
completely appreciate that, but I'd get into a demarcation dispute with the chair of the education committee, who's actually not far from where I am.
Sitting here.
I'm going to thank all of our guests for your contributions to today's meeting, and can we note the discussion, and can we also delegate authority to me as the chair in consultation with the party group leads to agree any appropriate outputs from this meeting? If that's agreed, thank you. Can we note the report as background to the discussion and the subsequent discussion? Sorry, if we can also move on to the economy work programme, which is on pages 57 and 58 in your pack. And can we note the work programme as it's set out there? The date of the next meeting is now scheduled for the 10th of September at 10 a.m. in this very place, the Chamber in City Hall. And the final item is for me to say that there is no further business that I consider to be urgent, and I then declare this meeting closed. Thank you.
GLA, Chamber, Sound. GLA, Chamber,